Alright. Sanguinius. To begin the process, I should have probably done this when I was gluing him together and not do it after priming. I would suggest that you heat up the miniature and move the leather straps back to make them look like they're falling, make it look in context with the fall of Sanguinius. That one leather strap really, I cannot tell you how much it annoys me just sticking straight up. Heat it up. The wrist is magnetized, by the way, I haven't just torn it off in a blind rage. Heat up the leather straps and push them in context with a falling being, so you can see it wouldn't just be straight down in that instance. I need to push them up and make it look like it has more of a flow. When you have Sanguinius' hair really being pushed by the wind behind him and having that one leather strap, especially on his right shoulder pad, sticking straight up, it just blows the reality of this 9-foot tall angel man for me. Now that's done, we could begin priming him. Whenever I tackle a project like this that I am just insanely intimidated by, I rely on the old techniques. I take my airbrush, I load white into it, and I sketch. I sketch out the basic tones. It gives me an idea of where I want to plant my brush strokes, and it just eases me into the entire process. It's very easy to correct any mistakes you make with this at this stage with an airbrush as opposed to a brush. So by doing this, it just allows me to try a few things out, like putting the line down his back piece, seeing where some of the highlights exist on his chest, down his stomach, and then that gives me a better idea in my mind of where I need to tighten things up, or what kind of tones I want to introduce where. I'm using a different airbrush for this video. This is the Iwata Custom Micron. If you were considering about buying a new airbrush, if you were thinking about upgrading your airbrush, I can comfortably say this is the greatest airbrush that man has created. It is freaking phenomenal. This thing could paint the eyes on a gnat. And I knew I had to give it a test run on Sanguinius. I absolutely love how it handles. It's expensive though, it's very, very expensive, so get saving. But if you are ever asked, or if I was ever asked what's the best airbrush in the world, well, this is it right here. Most of my highlights are hitting the top, so I'm generally working in a zenithal highlighting principle from the top down. I'm not sketching out the bounce effect. If you've watched the preview to this, you'll understand how I like to deconstruct metallic surfaces or non-metallic surfaces, and there's a little graph in the notebook describing that bounce effect you get from ambient lighting around it. I don't sketch that for the moment. I only put in the very strongest highlights, so the highlight upward. When doing this, it comes into very stark relief just how detailed this miniature is. And even though it's an amazing prospect for a painter, it can lead to some clutter. It can lead to a very indistinct, confusing look to the overall appearance of the miniature. So we have to be conscious at this early stage that any highlights, any shading, they need to be very clean, very crisp, very uncomplex. Perhaps uncomplex is the incorrect word to use in this here, but we need to make sure that any detailing we apply is very crisp and it stands out. We can't have any cluttered brushwork. We need to make sure, well, I guess we'll get onto that into the brushwork scenario, but when sketching it out, this is one of the great things about sketching with an airbrush. It allows you to see these details, and it gets your mind in gear for what you need to do later. Okay, it's a very, very cluttered miniature, not cluttered, very highly detailed miniature that does run the risk of being cluttered. So keeping that in mind, knowing exactly the approach that I want to take, it will modulate what kind of brush strokes, what kind of airbrush strokes, how many layers of paint I'll be adding on there, what kind of contrasts I want to build into the armor plates. Can't forget the weapons, can't forget the sword and the spear. Again, I'm only really roughly sketching in the tone, so a line up there, and then I'll break down the spear. I'm not sure whether this will be the final highlight and shadow in the when it comes to my brush strokes, but again, it gives me some kind of context, it gives me an introduction to it. If something looks good, I'll run with it. If it doesn't, well, I'll change it. The wings, same process. With Sanguinius's wings being primarily white, I will be sketching out more of a white tone on here. The temptation is to make them all white at this stage. We'll discuss this in more detail when it does come to the wing portion of the tutorial series. But weirdly enough, the purer white the wing, the more it will reflect the ambient surroundings around it. If this was a grey, excuse me, it'll drink in more the ambient temperatures, the ambient lighting around it. Because it's pure white, it will be reflecting the magma underneath, the sky above, any weird tonal shifts happening around Sanguinius as he's descending to stab that poor demon through the neck. But again, that's something we could discuss later. Sanguinius' face, Sanguinius' head, the majority of it has been done in white. I do like introducing more white on the skin tones to draw attention to the facial features. So I generally, as a rule of thumb, tend to over highlight with the pre-coat stage now, so I can control the scene absolutely later. And I can, if the head is lighter, your eye is drawn to it more naturally. Okay, now we come to the first coloration. I want to go dark, so I'm adding Rhinox hide. This is slightly too thin. You can see, especially on his right leg, when I apply it, it kind of spiders, it spreads out. It's not a cohesive layer of paint, so this is slightly too thin. When I apply it on the shoulder pad, you can see it's pooling up in areas. You don't want that. So in this case, I probably over-thinned the Rhinox hide nerves, probably because it's Sanguinius. Yep, it does happen. But I guess it's important not to allow that to stop you from painting, even though you're nervous. The next stage, so this is after a couple of layers of Rhinox hide. I have then applied a single layer of English uniform, and this is the second layer of English uniform. This stage is a lot better as an explanation for where to place your shadows and highlights. The previous layer kind of got lost in the Rhinox hide. Here, the second layer, you can see it much clearer. I'm aiming for the I'm trying to broaden out the highlight to mid-tone area. Now with this, I will be compressing these ranges tremendously later on, but I do want more of a wider mid-tone at this point, which I will then collapse by adding Rhinox hide plus black into the shadows, and then using a fluorescent paint plus white for the upper highlights later on. On this stage, the mid-tone is rather broad in its application. Again, just to see what works, what doesn't. At this stage, it's still very much in flux where I want to take this project. I'm just feeling my way into it. And do the same with your own miniature. By all means, use this as a cue, but be engaged with the miniature that you can physically see in front of you. And I would always encourage you to use these tutorials as a jumping off point rather than as a definitive guide as to paint Sanguinius. By all means, you can use these as the definitive guide. I'd be more than happy if you wanted to do it brush stroke, airbrush stroke to brush stroke. That would be amazing to see. But use them as I think the intention of these videos is to use them as a jumping off point for your creativity. But however you choose to engage with it, however you want to engage with it, I'm more than happy for you to do so. More of the chest plate, top of the shoulder pads, top of the thigh is hit with this layer because more of it will exist in direct sunshine, or what passes for direct sunshine on that planet. Whereas underneath his leg, the sides of his arm, underneath the pauldrons will be they won't have any of this mid-tone layer. They will receive a bounce layer later on, but none of the mid-tone. It's at this stage I got a little bit skittish. I wanted to re-establish some of those shadows to give my eye a greater guiding principle, a guiding line. So I've mixed up a bit of Rhinox hide again, and I'm reapplying the I guess you can't say it's the darker shadow because we'd need to include a bit more black into it. But essentially it's that awkward transition between the mid-tone and shadow. The bit that is conveniently not mentioned in the notebook section. Yeah, it was just at this stage I felt like my eye wasn't really recognising where the shadows and highlights should sit. It was a rather what's the correct phrase for this? Rather flat overall appearance. And I knew if I continued on highlighting I'd struggle to get the kind of contrast needed for non-metallic work. So that's what this reapplication of Rhinox hide is. As you can see, it's a lot thicker than our first layer. It's going down much nicer. As a very rough rule of thumb when it comes to this stage, it's not quite a wash layer. It's thicker than a filter. So a wash is designed to modulate the underlying layer, whereas a filter is designed to modulate all underlying layers. What this is more of a layer. So it's slightly thicker, the paint is slightly thicker in the airbrush. There's roughly 30% thinner to 70% paint. And I'm just re-sketching in the shadows. Next up, Japanese Uniform by Vallejo Model Color. So a lot of Vallejo Model Colors used here for this non-metallic scheme. Now this will be the highlight. It's a rather dull highlight, which we will need to juice up later on with yellows and fluorescent paints. Yep, that's right, you heard me say it, fluorescent paints. But for our purposes at this point, again, it's a sketch layer. It gets us somewhere in the region where we need to be, and it allows me to try different things to see if the color temperature is correct, sitting underneath the highlight and specular highlight stage. I'm paying particular attention to the lines of the miniature. You can see in the notebook demonstration how that yellow line runs centrally down his leg. Once I've established that line, I'll try and reinforce it as much as possible throughout the miniature. I'm dissecting the miniature. I'm trying to mentally map it out into several different portions, so a leg is no longer a thigh, it's a cylinder, for example. Same with all these shapes. I'm trying to break down these very complex, conflicting shapes into their most basic principles, and working up from there. My primary light source exists just above the Carnodon pelt, and I'm building the reflections around that. I'm also aware that there is a magma source underneath him, so the armor will need to pick up on red and orange hints later on. Okay, the unusual bit, fluorescent yellow and white. If you've never used fluorescent paints before, you can buy them through Vallejo. I believe MIG does them as well, but I've used the Vallejo, what's the name of them? The premium colour, fluorescent yellow. I've mixed it with a touch of white. The reason why we're using fluorescent paints is to draw more attention to those highlights. It's to give it more visual pop. When we use a matte colour, well, you can only push the contrast so far on it by adding an extra dimension to the work. When we talk about contrast, it's not only the value range. Value being the how much black and white is in a colour. It's not quite saturation, it's the chroma of a colour. It's the intensity on the colour chart. So by adding a fluorescent painter, we are increasing the chroma density of the paint. I'm hitting all the areas marked as a highlight in the graph in the notebook section. It would be a really good idea after you've painted this to take a photograph and run it through a black and white filter. You should be able to detect, or it should give the impression of it being a metallic surface, just looking at it. If it looks rather dull, if it doesn't have that strong contrast, well, we can continue building that up. But personally, the airbrush, the way I personally use the airbrush is to get you somewhere in the region of where you need to be, a bit like a sat nav. Well, my experiences of a sat nav, it'll get me somewhere where I want it to be, and then I'll kind of track it down the rest of the way. And same with the airbrush, it gives me very broad strokes, very broad strokes of this miniature, which I will then go on to refine with traditional brushwork. Okay, the bounce effect. In this particular instance, I'm using Parasite Brown. It's a very nice warm orangey brown, and I'm concentrating this towards the bottom of his left leg. that would pick up that magma glow effect just underneath his thigh, and anywhere really that would reflect the ambient surroundings of Sanguinius. What you may find with the stage is that it decreases the overall contrast of the piece, but we can build that back up with a brush. After this stage, I'm satisfied I have the very, very broad strokes in place of the non-metallic metal, and I can move on to refining it with the brush stages. And one of the nice little side effects of using the paints that we have, they're all regular acrylic paints. We can pop these onto our palette and continue using them. We don't have to do any color mixing or matching. We can use this precise recipe straight off the bat. Thank you very much guys for watching this non-metallic airbrush portion of the video. This will be followed up with the true metallic segment. I'm not quite sure whether I want to release a non-metallic and a true metallic and run them in tandem, or release one or the other at the end of the tutorial. Either way, thank you so much for watching, and here's a very pretty picture of Sanguinius complete. And this is the effect you'll be able to achieve at the end of the video tutorial series. I am so proud of this tutorial series. I think it's the best one produced so far. Please, if I could ask you to share the Patreon through social media, leave a good review. It helped me out so much. Thank you. And more importantly, if you try any of these techniques and you want some feedback, please get in touch with me. That's what I'm here for. Get your money's worth. Okay, thanks very much guys. I'll catch you in the next video. Bye bye.